And make sure All right. Good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. And if you got dessert, that was a special treat. I missed mine, so I'll have to get it later. So my name is Steve Smutko, and I'm a professor here in the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources. Also serve as, I do a little administration work as well, serve as associate dean. And most of my work are actually what I normally do in life, in work, is I do work in collaborative decision-making, collaborative problem-solving. And a lot of it is because we're in Wyoming, I deal with two basic issues, energy and recreation, and been doing that for a long time. So we're going to talk, this panel, what we're going to talk about is sort of the changes that we're seeing in recreation in Wyoming. And I'm gonna read something here. So what does the growth of outdoor recreation mean for Wyoming communities is really the setup here. So we have four panelists. Before I introduce them, I'm gonna just tell a little story about how I see the change and what in a personal, sort of a personal way, the change in outdoor recreation in Wyoming. So I live here in Laramie, and I'm a mountain biker and when the weather's good, and spend a lot of time up in Pole Mountain area, Vita Vu, Happy Jack. And have always, my favorite spot where I typically will start all of my mountain bike excursions is from the Summit Trailhead by the truck stop, or not the truck stop, but the rest stop up there. And typically, I get out there Saturday morning, normally see in most years up until recently, the same four cars there at 9:30 in the morning on Saturday that I always see, maybe 3 plates with a 5 and maybe 1 plate with a 2. And normally would then start out on my trip. Well, things have changed since COVID. Now, when I get there at 9:30, there's not just 4 cars, there's 14 cars in the parking lot. And so this, it was 2021, summer 2021, and I was going to do my mountain bike trip. Yeah, got there, sure enough, 15 cars in the parking lot at 9:30 in the morning. Set out on my trip, had my dogs with me. About 90 minutes later, get back to my pickup truck. Set my bike on the rail fence next to my truck, water my dogs, get the dogs in the truck, head out. And as I'm merging onto I-80 coming back to Laramie, I look in my rearview mirror to merge and I realize, oh crap, my bike's not in my truck. And so zip down 75 miles an hour to the next exit, 6 miles away, come back. It's probably 12 minutes, maybe 13. I get back and, oh, my bike's not there. And my immediate thought was, oh, probably somebody who knows me had a recognizable bike, probably saw my bike there and thought, oh, probably should get Smutko's bike somewhere where it's safe. And so, that was what I thought, called up the bike shops. Anybody turn in a white Specialized? No. Called the Laramie police, same thing. Sheriff, same thing. And I was sure it was going to show up. Until that night, and I realized my bike is gone. And it had been stolen from a trailhead. And I had left it for 10 minutes. And I realized things have changed. So we're going to talk about that change and what it means for Wyoming communities from the perspective of the Wyoming Business Council. So we have Amy Grenfell from the Wyoming Business Council, Patrick Harrington from the State Office of Outdoor Recreation. We have Brandon Kelly from U.S. Forest Service, and then Mike Jones representing local government county commissioner in Fremont County. And so the way what we're going to do, this is structured fairly simply, is we're going to have a conversation, and this is the rose, thorn, bud sort of conversation, sort of like what are the opportunities? Because certainly I'm very bullish on the opportunities that we have in front of us here in Wyoming. There's a lot going on. So we'll have that conversation. We'll talk about the challenges, and then we'll talk about what's next. How do we think about the future, and how do we prepare for the future? So what I'd like you to do is, so as you maybe open your statement, maybe tell a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start having a conversation. And this will be, if we can do it, this will be a panel conversation. And then we'll open it up for questions, maybe about 10 or 15 minutes of questions, which we will get on this little device in front of me. So the first question then is, yeah, what are the opportunities? How do we think about, so growth and change, really focus around, you know, the change in outdoor recreation, you know, how do we think about it in a very positive way? Particularly, Amy, from your perspective and the Wyoming Business Council.
Yeah, so thank you, Steve. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be on this panel today, and it's exciting to come and talk about the opportunities of outdoor rec when we look at an economic perspective, as well as it merging with the lifestyle that we all know and love. And so Steve mentioned I work for the Wyoming Business Council. And for those who don't know what that organization is, we are a state quasi-agency. We are the state's economic development agency. And so I'm the chief operating officer at the Business Council, but I work with an awesome team of people, of about 35 people who live all around the state and are part of all of our Wyoming communities, looking at ways to build resilience in our communities, help lead economic growth, and to really create that economic stability that we're all seeking. You know, as you all know, we historically have been a pretty solid boom and bust state, but I believe that outdoor rec has some great opportunities for us when it comes to creating some additional economic diversification and aligning then also with Wyoming's great culture.
So then, Patrick, from your perspective, what are the opportunities that we're seeing?
Thank you, Steve. Patrick Harrington, manager of the Wyoming Office of Outdoor Recreation. I think my list, I started jotting down some thoughts here, and I think the list could probably take up a number of pages. I feel similar, quite bullish on the opportunities existing for outdoor recreation in Wyoming, but a couple that maybe are helpful, I think, just to frame this conversation. We have open space that is a unique thing, public land in most of our towns in any direction you drive. And so there's opportunities for development. Generally, I think folks are pretty excited about outdoor recreation. You know, Taylor and I were talking at our table. Are there communities that are really pushing back and saying, we don't want anything from you, go home? And we're not really seeing that. There are certainly points of friction and places where certain ideas are less palatable than they might be in a different community. But overall, I think there's general positivity, and this is probably me preaching to the choir right now, just looking at the faces in this room. Maybe, you know, audience might change that perspective to some degree, but generally I feel that broad level of support. As Dave mentioned this morning, with the great help of Representative Newsom and others in the legislature, we created the Outdoor Recreation and Tourism Trust Fund this year. That will certainly create opportunities for outdoor rec development for generations. It really is a legacy. We all are fortunate to live at its initiation. That really gives us that opportunity to build things a Wyoming way and to protect a Wyoming perspective as we grow our outdoor recreation economy. And then the last piece I'll point out is I run an interagency team. And so there's business councils on that, and Department of Transportation, Office of State Lands, Game and Fish, and Office of Tourism as well. And what that's allowing us to do is really coordinate across state government and deliver a quicker product, a more efficient product, and a product that's well considered by all these different state agencies and gets that kind of buy-in at an initial and ground floor level.
And then Brandon, from, you know, forest managing, the land manager perspective, you know, as we see more and more outdoor recreation activities, more and more people coming in, you know, how do you see that in a positive sense in the way that from where you sit? So what are the opportunities? You know, what are the benefits? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so I think, you know, one of the big benefits I see is this whole room, basically. You know, we've got government people here, we have nonprofits, we've got state folks here. And so really it's, you know, we only have so many resources internally, to, you know, to manage public lands. And we need everyone's help as we develop these tourism and things like that and managing tourism. And so in order to be proactive, we need, the collaborative groups, and we need all these different, resources and things to help manage stuff. And so, we're really looking to collaborate with, all levels of government and, nonprofits, and really try to be more proactive and, create the tourism and manage the tourism, in a way that's sustainable versus being more reactive and, having increasing tourism and then being in a reactive stage of trying to fix what you didn't plan for.
All right, and then Mike, so, Fremont County, you're no strangers to outdoor recreation enthusiasts.
No strangers.
Yeah.
Maybe I come at this from a little bit different angle, but I see in Wyoming that we're at an interesting spot. I got involved in one of the collaboratives that Patrick has talked about, and early on in 2019, and helped convene that group with Dave Glenn and Chris Floyd. We're at a different place even 4 years later. Just the fact that we passed a trust fund, which boy, 4 years ago, I would have said we've got no chance. Watching what goes on in Colorado and looking at GoCo. But so many little pockets, and it's happening in Lander. We've got a very active bike club. We have the Climbers Alliance. We have Trout Unlimited is a very active community. We have a lot of activity, and I see those things coming together and the conversation rising, and not without bumps along the road. But I see the conversation is being elevated. Interesting story. 4 years ago, I asked Lloyd Larson to look up the outdoor recreational budget in the budget, and we couldn't find it. We had formed the department in 2016 under Matt Mead, but it was like a third level line. You had to go digging under the carpet to find that there is a line item in there under 246B or whatever it was. But I feel the momentum and the conversation. And I am a little bit philosophical. We've hit bumps along the road in our local conversations, but it's elevated and it's brought more people to the table in a more organized fashion. And I think it's so much more constructive, and the momentum is continuing to grow, and people are recognizing that is an important segment of our economy, and how to enter into that conversation and engage in it. So to me, it's watching the snowball gain momentum, and I think we're at a really neat point.
And Amy, I want to get back to you. So are you seeing any uptick in business interest in this area? And so where is it coming from? And, how do we understand that?
Yeah, so we are seeing it from a couple of different places, actually. So oddly, as I think you all know, the pandemic was an interesting thing in Wyoming, and it was an interesting thing in what it brought to Wyoming. So I think because of the pandemic and being post-pandemic, there were a number of people around the country who saw the great things that we already knew about Wyoming, and were looking to maybe leave their current homes, maybe looking to leave their current states where they maybe had businesses. And so I think some of that has been helpful with Wyoming. We did see an uptick post-pandemic of businesses and people just in general looking to come to Wyoming. The other interesting thing, and again, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in the room, is other states' legislation. That's also something to talk about. And that other, so let's talk about the firearms industry, for example. Other states have different firearms views than Wyoming does. And so for an industry like the firearms industry, Wyoming is an attractive home. And so when you look at that collectively from the outdoor rec standpoint, Wyoming has been desirable both post-pandemic as well as with other states' legislation because of all of the things that we already knew and held closely to ourselves, but it became much more apparent to others around the country who might be looking for the same things.
And then I want to circle back to Brennan. So within the Forest Service, there's been an evolution in terms of sort of where you put your emphasis. And I know that outdoor recreation is, I would imagine you're paying a lot more attention. Staff is changing around outdoor recreation and being able to manage for it. Are you seeing that? Is that something that you're seeing within the region?
Yep. So, well, even at the national level, there's an initiative called Reimagine Recreation to really dig into recreation and recognizing the, economic values and all the values, and just the amount of recreation opportunities that we're providing and managing. And then at the regional level, we've also more recently set a priority to really focus in on recreation and make sure that our individual forests, have the adequate staff to be able to work with collaborative groups and work with partners and work with our outfitter and guides and this variety of people, so that we're coming to the table to be present in these conversations and things like that, and have the resources to have professional trail staff, to develop recreation folks that can manage the campgrounds and things like that. So, yeah, it's definitely a priority, and it's a huge economy, and there's a lot of interest.
Okay. So I'm going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about the thorny side of growth in the outdoor recreation economy, or growth in outdoor recreation interests anyway, in Wyoming. I related my story. It's very personal. But, maybe from, let's start with the business council. What are some of the, maybe, is there any barriers or challenges or anything that you see that it's not all roses? There are some thorns. What might those be?
Yeah, and this is actually really a question I'd love to have with some of the private business owners in the room too. I think our seasonality, where seasonality is an opportunity when you look at the different types of outdoor rec that we have, the seasonality also creates some workforce challenges, I think, for our employers. So seasonality, I think supply chain access can also be a little bit of a challenge. I think some of our companies in Wyoming have figured out how to overcome that with a direct to consumer model. That's a little bit easier. But supply chain is also another one.
Maybe, can you give any examples or what you've seen? Maybe highlight that a little bit.
Yeah. So looking at the seasonality piece, I know, as you look at our resort communities, especially Jackson Hole, they've had some challenges from the workforce standpoint of getting people in when they need them. And then maybe they don't have jobs all year round, or maybe they do in Jackson. So you've got some challenges there. I guess the other one I would add, Steve, too, is housing. Housing can also be a challenge for some of our outdoor rec businesses in the industry. And especially as we look at that resort community or some of the communities that have the more expensive housing, which is also those same communities that tends to have the higher outdoor rec, that can be a challenge for our workforce also.
Yeah. And Patrick, you have a mission, your agency does, and that is to see if we can grow outdoor recreation and economy around that. What are the thorns that you're seeing? And what do you worry about when you think about it, in the next couple of years?
Well, Steve, this is probably another place where I could fill a page. To me, what bubbles to the top is probably how truly complicated a development really is. And if our mission is to diversify the economy, our vehicle to get there is often designing infrastructure, outdoor recreation infrastructure that exists in communities that don't have it. And so how do you start in some cases from square one, or maybe in the case of Commissioner Jones' neighborhood at Square 45, and move those communities into a place where they're where they want to be. These are really tricky conversations. And, as Director Glenn mentioned this morning, it's several layers of bureaucratic work to get to that outcome. And so to me, that's one of the major challenges. And it's not that it's impossible to overcome. It's that it requires that stick-to-itness, and you've got to just, have grit and say, this is going to be a 3-year process. We are going to walk hand in hand with the BLM as we develop this trail project. There's going to be bumps in the road, but we're going to get there if we stay focused. And so developing like that level of community buy-in is a challenge, because there are going to be pieces that just naturally avert the course of the project, which is healthy and good and should occur in that public comment process. And so, there's been plenty of lessons learned in our agency in that regard, but I think that to me stands out as one of the major complicating factors. And then another one I think is just worth pointing out, because there's a little bit of STEM to it as well, is a pipeline of employees that can support that. And so there's a couple of STEMs there. One is the Outdoor Rec Tourism Management degree program here at the university, which is driving a pipeline of students into this world. I came out of the Wyoming Conservation Corps, was the director there for a couple of years. proudly had over 51%, over 51, that's an awfully exact number, stay and work in Wyoming. And I always argued that fact is because we're giving them skills that are marketable in Wyoming. You can work for a federal land manager as a graduate of the Haub school. And then there's, what Darren Wells and Stacy Wells are doing at CWC in Lander in Fremont County to grow that trail building pipeline so that as, hopefully grants roll out from our office and we grow the capacity of our state that workforce exists to build and maintain those trails as well. And so it's kind of a fly the plane or we're building it at the same time, whatever that phrase is.
Well, flying the plane while we're building it, but
There you-
also it's
there you
full of
go.
people and getting fuller, right?
Yes, sir.
So do you think we're going to be able to stay ahead of the curve, or are we already behind the curve in that regard?
In some ways, I think we are behind the curve.
Uh-huh.
And that's generally, I think that's in that workforce piece. But start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, right? We only start from where we are today. In this room, in this conversation is where we start forward. And so we can lament the things that we have not achieved yet, but we still have to go achieve what we can.
Uh-huh. So then Brennan, so thinking about growth and outdoor recreation, from your perspective as a federal land manager or from a federal land management perspective, then I think, it's probably fairly obvious what those thorns are. So maybe make that clear for those who may not think how obvious that might be. But, I know every time I go into the forest, I'm seeing more and more people in places that I hadn't expected to see so many people. What does that do for you? And how do you think about that? How does the Forest Service go about thinking about that?
Yeah, so there's a number of things. So, us as the land manager, we have the lands that everyone wants to go visit. And so when we're talking about expanding tourism, improving tourism in communities and stuff, usually it's BLM or Forest Service lands that they're talking about. And so, we already have our existing infrastructure that we're managing. And, we only have so much money for staffing and stuff like that internally. And so when we're talking about increasing recreation infrastructure to expand, economics of tourism and stuff like that, a bit of a thorn maybe is like, hey, we don't have the additional staff internally to build an additional trail system and maintain that additional trail system by ourselves.
Right.
So that's it. That's one concern that we have. We also have some problems with recruitment right now, either in our entry level positions, finding seasonal workers in our permanent positions. And we're working on some different methods with that, but and some of that is attributed to the affordable housing issues. So it's really expensive. Some of the communities, one reason why jobs are getting turned down with the Forest Service is there's nowhere affordable to live. And then I guess another thing is just working in these collaborative groups. Not everything is always rosy, and there's a lot of different perspectives. We can't be everything to everyone. I'd love to be able to build every single thing that every trail user, hunter, all the different users want to have. But usually there has to be some middle ground that we find. So we're providing some opportunities for each of the different user groups, but we're not giving everything to everyone. And so being able to be in a collaborative group, hear different perspectives, but there will be some thorns and bumps along the road when when we're doing these things, but that's just to be expected. And as the federal government, we have our laws, environmental planning we have to follow. So sometimes things take longer than people would like, but really it's just so that we're making sure that we're also thinking about the environmental impacts as we're expanding recreation and things like that. So sometimes timelines can take a little bit longer and people can get frustrated, but some patience within those types of groups.
Yeah, and I think, you brought that up, sort of the NEPA conundrum, right? We need to have NEPA. We need to be able to take a really hard look at what impacts the new infrastructure may have on the forest, but it does take a dang long time. Are you guys seeing, are you putting more resources toward that, or, how can, is there a way that we can start to move that forward a little more quickly in your mind, or are you guys?
Well, so we have our federal laws that we have to apply or use, so we can't circumnavigate the NEPA process and things like that. But as time progresses, we do get categorical exclusions. We just recently had some new ones that allowed us to authorize outfitter and guide permits more quickly, because as long as they were operating in a place that the general public was allowed to operate. It was a pretty straightforward permit to authorize, whereas we used to have a longer process to do that. So that's kind of a cool, exciting new thing to more quickly be able to allow outfitter and guide use. So some of our other environmental planning, it just depends on what the type of project is. Motorized trails, it takes a little bit more because of our process requires an environmental assessment. But yeah, it just depends on what the project is. We do have some ways to streamline some. I have had some examples because I used to work with some ski areas in previous projects, and we didn't have the internal staffing to fully run the NEPA process. And so we were able to work with a contractor, a NEPA contractor, to expand our ability to help write the EA, work with the specialist, even contract out some of the work with the specialist to help complete that. And it doesn't replace having our existing specialists because they have the local knowledge of the wildlife and all that stuff, but it can help build some capacity to be able to do projects like that in a place where there's limited capacity. And there's also like a big focus on fire and fuels right now. And so a lot of planning effort will be going towards like getting fuels projects on the ground, protecting communities and things like that. So, sometimes if it's a recreation project, we have to look at more creative ways to how we're going to get that done.
And Mike, so from your perspective as a local government, as a county commissioner, what are some of the rubs you're seeing, particularly in Fremont County, but even looking more broadly in Wyoming?
Yeah, well, we had a wonderful experience with the the Ferrata. It was a heck of a learning curve, and that was a great example. The whole state was kind of watching in, and I bet I got a call. I got a call every other week. One week it was somebody telling me to quit trying to turn Lander into Jackson, and the other week was, what the heck did you guys do wrong over there? What happened? And I think, we talk a lot more about process now, but you can't separate process from personality either. And there are some pitfalls along the way with when personalities and passions run into each other. That's where you see the most excitement. That's where it generated a lot of press and that sort of thing. I think now that we're having better conversation about those types of things. I see a lot of other groups, not just there, but Mike Kuzik with Wyoming Pathways, we talk about this probably weekly on how do we do consensus? How do we build consensus? How do we bring the groups together? There was a great article in the New York Times a couple of years ago, and it was talking about rebuilding after the storms. And basically the short story was the fatigue of consensus building. It is, the NEPA process is extraordinarily long, and it is even on the local level, trying to keep those relationships open and those conservation, those conversations, just keeping them open so you don't bog down. And then there's there's skepticism as whether you really learned your lesson or not, right? Always a little watching out for that, but yeah, that's real stuff. The fatigue thing is in the forefront of my mind a lot of times. Is like, how do you reinvigorate the conversation, or is that dead? You move on to the next one. Yeah. And you just but anyway, that's what I got.
Well, Patrick, I'm going to turn it back to you. And that's sort of like, I want to maybe address some of the hidden things that we don't really think about, or maybe I hadn't thought about it until somebody told me you should think about this. And that is, as we bring more people into the outdoors, how are we supporting our search and rescue operations? That seems to me like, oh, we better pay attention to that. Is there addressing that?
Well, very good point, Steve. And there's for the room, an initiative right now in Teton County Search and Rescue to buy themselves a helicopter. So just a plug, if you want to donate, that's a great opportunity. There's a thing we can all do. it's a challenging conversation, right? Most of
Yeah.
these are incredibly underfunded organizations, often volunteer run or almost always volunteer run, called out in the middle of the night to go hang off the side of a mountain or walk through a bunch of snow to try to save somebody. Bryn in our office has been focused in on our relationship with search and rescue for 2 years. Outcomes are really hard here. It would be nice to say, just throw some money at the problem and that will help. But at some point, it's an insatiable need in that with increased visitation, it's a capacity thing. It's going to be hard to get to a level where everyone feels like they have every tool in the book. And so, I don't have a silver bullet answer here for here's what we can all do, but engage is probably the best option. When you buy your fishing license, donate to search and rescue and access. Yes. It's Dave's comment from earlier, ounces make pounds. It really is our responsibility to help fund those organizations. There are conversations happening right now to see what we can do to provide additional capacity. But so far it's been a big challenge. And I think we will grassroots this thing for now and try to give them as much support as they can have. And I'll just also say, my dad was a search and rescue member up in Bighorn. Anyone from County 9 here today? This always happens. Me. But my dad was a search and rescue guy up in the Bighorns, and I just remember, weekend after weekend, getting called out to go search for a missing hiker or something. And it is a job that takes a lot from a person as well to volunteer to do that. Yeah. Just would encourage everyone in this room to grassroots that as much as we can. We don't have a silver bullet solution yet.
And just to add on to that, are there any other those things that are in the back of your head thinking, this could be a problem?
Anyone else?
I'm gonna poke a little bit on this one. Makes you worry? Anything that you're like,
well,
outside
I
your
think
regular budget or whatever?
Yeah, no, I think the scale of what we're working on is the thing that maybe keeps me up at night. And it's, someone could ask me a question and then 10 minutes later I can get asked essentially the same question from a different perspective. And it's apples and oranges. I mean, it's just the scale of the outdoor recreation economy, the number of things it touches, and the difficult nature of moving anything forward. It's a real challenge. It's probably what I spend most of my waking hours concerned about, is that piece right there. Is I want to do best by the state and best by the people that live in these communities, and figuring out what that is and where do we go with that information is a challenge.
Yeah. And then Brendan, I'm gonna go back to you on sort of the, as we see our campgrounds fill up, you can't get away on trails. Is that something that you're seeing west-wide? So you're region 2, right? And how are you guys responding to that? Is that something that is like on a daily agenda, or it's just business as usual? How is the Forest Service working through some of that, particularly in the growth of the outdoor recreation industry?
It's something we're definitely monitoring. Basically every single week we're talking about some aspect of that. There's no gate that we can shut at the national forest boundary. People are coming whether we like it or not. And so, basically across the board, most national forests probably seeing similar increase in numbers as those state park figures that were talked about earlier. A lot of increasing visitation, whether it's campgrounds, trails, hunting, all the different things. So a lot of increase in use and stuff like that. It's a lot of our conversations over, there's increase in user conflicts. If you go from a trailhead that usually maybe, there was 4 people that used to park there. Now the parking lot's full at 9 a.m. And so, the one type of thing in we're calling it destination stewardship is, there's a couple examples of like putting a webcam up at the trailhead. So on a really high use trailhead, people can see before they even drive the hour to get there that, oh, that's full, I'm going to go somewhere else. And so maybe those high use places are at capacity and that we need to promote some different places. And then if we are promoting some of those different places, do those places have infrastructure to facilitate the use? So maybe some places when they had low use, there was the little bit of infrastructure was perfectly fine. But now all of a sudden when the use is tripled in that area, you need to look at expanding and enhancing that infrastructure to facilitate that amount of use. And so, a lot of conversations are on that type of stuff. And then also just the user experience. And so when you go from, lower use to higher use, there's some proactive planning approaches that you can take. And so like directional trails is an example. So, you know, you used to be able to go there was 4 people on the trail, you'd never see anyone. Okay, now you have 30 cars in the parking lot or 50 cars in the parking lot. You're running into tons of different people. Your experience is going down. But maybe you can make that a directional trail. And if everyone's going in the same direction, you only see 2 people because everyone's going in the same direction versus seeing everyone that's on the trail. And so it's kind of a creative way. You're not adding a mile of trail, but it's a different type of a design solution to basically making the user experience better. So.
All right. So I want to move on. We'll talk about now the but part, right? So the future, what do we, and I'll start it with the question, what are the conversations that we need to be having to address some of the issues in growth and outdoor recreation? I'm going to start with you, Mike, because you kind of ended with that about fatigue, but we need to continue, right, to have these conversations. What are those?
I think globally in the state, the conversations are a little bit fragmented. I mentioned trout unlimited. I mentioned hunters. I mentioned bicyclists. And while we do have different objectives within those groups, it all fits under this big umbrella of outdoor recreation and our outdoor recreation economy. And I think that as we go forward, and this would be for those in local government and state government and federal government, is how do we bring that conversation together so it's meaningful? And that if we were to put more resource to it, what would that look like? And what does that infrastructure look like to the state? What do we believe in? A natural break that Wyoming has, from my perspective, is that we love being small. We love being remote. We love our big white spaces. That is somewhat opposed to the development of outdoor recreation and more tourism and wanting to diversify our economy. So bringing those conversations and having more constructive conversation about that. One of the challenges that we hit on the local level is who should be at the table and when. We thought in a number of instances that we had all the right people at the table. We talked about Wolf Point and expanding climbing and getting earlier access into an area. And we did have all the right people at the table, but something didn't kick in until very 6 months down the path. We're sitting there and 2 of our land managers say, well, wait a minute, we can't do this. Well, you guys been sitting there for 6 months. What's going on? It just didn't kick in, and not to pick on them. But the answer back was always interesting to me. Well, you didn't provide the pathway. You didn't provide the forum for us to do that. And so there that comes back to that process personality of how do we bring that together on a local level and at the state level of how do we make this more meaningful? Because outdoor recreation to me may be something different than it does to everybody here. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. So Amy, from the business community then, what conversations do we need to be having as we think about sort of moving into the next 5 years?
That's a good question, Steve. I think from a business community standpoint, at the Business Council, we're ultimately looking at jobs. We're interested in those sustainable jobs that help grow our communities and make them resilient. And so from an outdoor rec standpoint, jobs are coming from a couple of different places. They're coming from the tourism part of outdoor rec. As people come in, we've got the service providers who are helping to support that tourism aspect. We also have the outdoor rec industry jobs, where we've got companies like Maven, for example, or Kafaru, or Weatherby, or some of these other companies that really have kind of captured the outdoor rec field and made it their business and their focus. And so I think as we look at the workforce piece of how we support both that tourism side, but also how we support the businesses that are growing in Wyoming and creating these jobs, we need to continue to maintain that quality of life, because that's what's continuing to attract our outdoor rec businesses to Wyoming. It's also what's driving that tourism. And so it's a balance of that quality of life, building the infrastructure that our workforce in these industries is looking for. It's very, very common for us at the Business Council to hear from businesses from other states often who are saying, we want to be in Wyoming because our employees, our workforce wants to have access to all the things that you have. And so it is kind of a funny scenario that Wyoming is in, is that we have opportunity to grow because of our outdoor rec, but then how do we manage it? And that's what we're all talking about today, to make sure that we still maintain what's desirable about our great outdoors and our wide open spaces. And so that workforce piece is really, really important, I think, for us to look at, both from what is the workforce wanting when they're not working, and then also what's bringing these companies to Wyoming.
And maybe, I mean, in terms of having the workforce that we need, is that something that is also sort of on the table in terms of providing, people who are trained in specialized areas to fill those?
Yeah, I think so. And I think Wyoming's doing, we've got really bright spots, I think, in that workforce piece from an education standpoint. We've talked about a few of those today with the Haub School and what's going on there. We've also got the Alpine Science Institute at CWC. We've got Knowles. Knowles is something for any of you. I'm certain there are people in this room who've either worked for Knowles or currently work for Knowles. That is such a bright spot in our community, as the commissioner well knows, because what's happened and what we've seen happen with Knowles is bringing people from all over the world to our amazing state. Whether those people who have worked for Knowles are working for Knowles or not, they're usually staying in Wyoming, and they're going on to create new businesses, and they're going on to continue to build their communities. And so I think from that standpoint, we've got some really bright spots on the education front.
And we'll be talking about entrepreneurship later. I think that maybe tomorrow, but maybe something I'll come back to. But so Patrick, sort of what are the conversations that you would like to see happen here in Wyoming over the next 5 years to do the things that you hope to see happen?
So I think two are coming to mind initially. One sort of in response to your comments a minute ago, and so I'll start there, and somewhat to yours too. It's the idea of, like, do we kill the goose that lays the golden egg by developing outdoor recreation in Wyoming? Do we lose wide open outdoor spaces? And I think that's a serious concern, and it's something through the process of the trust fund legislation moving through that we heard often. And the people that represent those organizations in Wyoming showed up in spades and provided their comments that this is an important piece of the work you're doing. Myself and Director Glenn both have a conservation background. It's easy to say, trust us, but that's not a thing that people do to government. We make rules so that you trust the rules. And so fully understand that that's there. That's our offices. We call it EDC. It's, Dave mentioned it this morning, educate, disperse, and concentrate, where our initial goal is to educate users. If you had 400,000 people using a trail this year and it had a whatever certain level of impact, if you can half that impact through educational campaigns, next year that same trail could experience 800,000 guests at the same level, roughly the same level of impact. That stretches our capacity. The disperse piece is really important because we look not away from Northwest Wyoming, but into communities that have a bigger need or a bigger desire to grow their tourism economies and do so in a way that makes sense to those communities that live with it. That's really important to also stretch that capacity. And then the last is to concentrate. And this is the piece I think gets most closely to the concerns you had were, and where we could kill the goose that lays the golden egg is by putting outdoor rec everywhere. And I don't know, that's certainly not our goal. And I don't think there's anyone in this room that would say, build me a trail everywhere. I think we have to be sensitive to what the locals like, and just what is best for the ecosystem. And so we're not going to put a campground on a spring in the middle of the red desert where there's nothing else for 20 miles. Instead, what we might do is move it 20 miles away to a place that can handle that type of use. and then invite those guests in and build resilient landscapes that can support an increased use. And so that's a really important conversation we're having right now. And then the other one, probably a much quicker line, is how do we support each other's ideas? And so that's the goal of our collaboratives, is to figure out how we do that. And it is an extremely difficult task to get the person whose only goal is whatever to say, yeah, we're also cool with building a motorized play park just outside of town too. We're getting there in some communities, and in others we have some space to go. But that's certainly something we have to consider to maintain that sense of community that just generally exists in outdoor recreation.
All right. And then Brendan, from your perspective, Federal Land Management Agency, what are the conversations that you would like to see happen in Wyoming around this?
Yeah, I mean, he already touched on a lot of the stuff is, a lot of these collaborative conversations, getting ahead of it before it's an issue, or, being more proactive rather than reactive. The conversations of like, how are we protecting the community, the local interests and stuff like that, the places that they love to visit, how are we, sustainably developing recreation? So maybe it's concentrating recreation, whereas maybe it's dispersing, depending if you're trying to focus on, developing new tourism versus like, oh, we have, some critical wildlife habitat that we're trying to protect. So in that case, we're focusing on concentrating and making a concentrated trail system or whatever it is that it has a really good recreation experience. And maybe you have to do some design to make that a good recreation experience, but then you're also proactively like setting aside an area that's not developed, for the long term to like, have those areas for the animals and different things.
And Patrick, you had brought this up, this idea of the collaboratives, and Mike, you sit on one. I think it's a great idea. I mean, I don't know who's thought that up. It was Dave Glenn or whenever. I was sort of in the start of those conversations, but I thought, yeah, this is maybe a way of getting ahead of some of that conflict, right? But maybe from a long view. And maybe Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Sort of like the collaborative you've been engaged in has been in operation for what, a couple of years, right? 2 or 3 years?
2019.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, how do you see that playing out? I mean, do you have high hopes, or are you like, we're fatigued?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's going in the right direction. It continues to go, and it continues to evolve, which it should. We've got some folks, and somebody touched on this a little bit earlier. What are kind of raised the question around what assets do we have and how do we deploy them? This outdoor recreational program, the University of Wyoming, it's bringing people into the workforce that are prepared and understand the dynamics of change and bringing change within the outdoor recreational space. And we've got a really good one. Brand facilitates the conversation in Fremont County. We've seen more people come, and I thought we might face a period where we see that participation fall off. It's gone the other way. It's increased in participation. It's increased in collaboration, and we've got some different players at the table now. And I'm encouraged because that evolution as it goes through, to me, is going to make it more robust. As long as we can stop and say, what are the lessons learned? What did we learn the last 2 years? What do we do now? Because there's still opportunity to improve those processes, especially because we're all human. We're all folks that make mistakes. But can we learn from those mistakes, and can we see a higher goal that we can all get behind? We don't all agree, but if we can find those common goals together, then we can quit doing this and move this way a little bit. And that's going to be some fits and starts, but
Yeah.
That's what I see. I'm encouraged, actually.
So now I'm going to read some questions from the audience here. And this one, we haven't really talked about it, but I think we've touched on it. And question is, this is from Rebecca. So we hear a lot about Wyoming culture, right? And I think that's kind of how we come into these things, right? Well, it's the name of the conference, building it the way we want it, right? And it's a representation of quote, our culture, whatever that might be. So what do we need to protect and foster that? And is there widespread agreement on even what that means? This is an open-ended question. I don't know if anybody can actually answer it, but it's a good conversation starter. And we want to take a start.
Yeah, Steve, what I was going to add to that is that we need to remember our culture is an asset too. And that very, very often we have people seeking what we view as just our everyday. And so, I guess my other interpretation of that, of culture or the word culture is maybe values. And again, I think that's an asset for us.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? Come on. I mean, it is sort of a central theme that we all sort of like dance around, but it's important.
Yeah, I
Go
mean,
ahead,
it's
Brendan.
just, yeah, similar to what she says, you know, it is a resource that we're looking at, and that's what we're finding out through these collaborative groups and stuff like that of, you know, what is that community's values, and then how do we proactively manage for that, and kind of the stewardship of that's part of the education. You know, we might be having education about how to reduce your trail impacts and how to, you know, do other things, but also one is how do we maintain that local community's character and not trample on it, because maybe people coming from outside the state visiting might not know what the priorities and values are of that community. So that's part of that education, you know, to people that are visiting from out of town.
I actually like what Brendan said too about maintaining a community culture. I think we need to remember that we don't always have a state culture.
Yeah.
We need to look at it at the community level as well. You know, the other thing I think that's kind of interesting about that is that as we grow, it doesn't mean that we lose a culture. Sometimes it just adds more to it.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. So I'm letting you off the hook on this one, Michael. I was going to actually ask you a pointed question about culture, but
Sure.
skip it. So I want to talk about, this is a good one. I think it's about data, right? So we all need information in order to plan well. So how important is it for each of you to have accurate data on, let's say, participation, use, et cetera? And then what are the barriers to collecting the data that you need? Anybody?
I'll bite. You know, Steve, earlier you asked me, are we behind? And actually, this is an area where I do think we have lacked some of the capacity to make the arguments that we want to make in gathering data. And so there's a forest or a recreation area in Wyoming managed by the Forest Service that I asked for some visitation data from, and they sent me 1,200 as a number of people that visited last year. And it's only because of the way they counted it was tough. But credit to the Forest Service that they're counting it. I think the majority of the time, you know, who's using a trail, we started with, you know, 4 cars in the parking lot. If we had a trail counter at that trailhead, we'd know, you know, how often those 4 cars are using the trails on up through the pandemic to see where the actual need exists. And to what extent we're experiencing this higher level of visitation, which has those knock-on effects of increased ability to win grant awards, better ability to demonstrate the need of your community at the legislature. The data piece is critical, and I think we've been a step behind in some of our ability to collect that. And I hope I didn't throw the forest under the bus.
Nope. Yeah, I mean, I was just, you know, go off that. So, you know, we have some data standards that we have, the National Visitor Use Monitoring. So every forest, every 5 years does this very coarse scale visitation and types of uses and stuff like that. But it doesn't get to the micro scale of like in this specific community, in this particular trail system, what's going on, what are the users and issues and things like that. And so that's where we really look to like partnerships and different things to help us doing some of the monitoring. You know, there's examples of, say, a mountain bike club putting out trail counters and doing some like surveys and things like that, because we're trying to figure out who's using the trail and what trails we need to add or change and different things like that. So, you know, it can really help support a science-based approach to supporting a planning process for things. And, you know, as an example, I've seen as a rec manager when I was previously a planner, sometimes I call it the missing middle. You know, when we do public scoping on a rec planning project, we might get a lot of people show up, and maybe it's like a lot of one type of user group and a lot of another type of user group that are really active and really vocal in our public scoping times. But there's a lot of people as a manager I know that aren't showing up as a, the main user group because, for whatever reason, they're just not there. And so, sometimes these trail surveys can get that data of like, hey, like the mountain bikers really showed up and the motorized community really showed up, but none of the hiking community, the dog walkers showed up, and they're the biggest user group on our trail system. And so sometimes those trail surveys are another data point to look at of like, hey, well, what about this user group that's not being represented or active in your maybe collaborative group or public scoping. So it's just another tool, and it's definitely useful. It's kind of like a non-biased, data source that you can use for planning.
And Amy, business council, what are you guys doing with data?
Yeah, we do quite a bit with data. As you can imagine, it's a lot around jobs and wages and GDP and other economic indicators. And so we are looking at that. We also look at industry data quite a bit, seeing what changes are out there, comparing to other states, looking at growth in other states, maybe in certain sectors, and whether Wyoming is or is not lagging in those same certain sectors, especially the surrounding states in the Rocky Mountain West. So we look quite a bit at data from an economic standpoint.
Steve, I'd like to say a few things about that. I think as a state, we are completely in the dark.
Yeah.
Who here can find out what the granularity of your sales tax and how those dollars are being generated in your own communities? You can't see it. You can't find it. And if you do, it's too late. It's after, in the medical community, they talk about evidence-based practice. I'm quoting you, Mike. Yeah. Because they collect data on everything, on every single thing in a hospital and a medical environment. We need to step up our game, and I applaud the agencies that are trying to collect that data, but we got to take their toothpick away and give them a baseball bat. We got to get this state organized around collecting data and moving towards a more informed environment. These conversations about outdoor recreation, we throw out that 1.5 billion or 3 billion or whatever it is. You can see the eyes glaze over down at the legislature and say, well, gee, I had no idea, and I get that, but wouldn't it be great if we could break that all down into each community and what's driving that? It's all anecdotal. So it's a huge step that we all need to take, and not just at the local level or at the state level, but at the federal level too. And we've got to embrace the idea that data is so important.
Yeah. Brendan.
And I just wanted to add one thing too. It also helps us monitor trends as well. So, talking about being proactive, if you're seeing a trend of, okay, we just had a 50% increase over the last 5 years in trail visitation. I was like, well, if we continue on this trend in another 5 years, we know we're going to be in this place. And so you can already maybe start a planning process for the visitation you're expecting in 5 years from then. And so it allows you to be more proactive as well sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I've only got a couple of minutes left. There's a whole bunch of really interesting questions in there, but we don't have time. Maybe just as a quick wrap up, any last thoughts that each of you would like to say before we finish the panel?
Yeah, just a few things. I think the biggest thing is continue to have conversations, and forums like this are a perfect example. When doing that, assume positive intent, find your commonalities. Remember that Wyoming can really be that place where your personal and your professional purposes align, and make sure that you use what we know, or that we all use what we know to activate something new.
Patrick.
In my opinion, I think Wyoming's outdoor recreation economy industry continues to grow for one reason, and that's intention. And I think there's you all in the room working on that, our state legislature working on that, our governor supporting that, the business council bringing in businesses into Wyoming. None of these things happen on their own. We will continue to see it grow. We will experience setbacks together. We will move the whole industry forward together. And so I really think the idea of intention and togetherness, if you could take two things from my comments today, I think those would be two great ones to take.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Brendan.
Yeah, I guess a couple things. And, I mentioned multiple times being more proactive than reactive. So, having these conversations early and often, everything like that. Thinking outside the box too, maybe for 20 years, you've always done it one way and the partnerships have always done it one way, but maybe it's time to change and the partnerships can be be in a different respect as far as, maybe the partnership always helped in one role, but now we need to help in a different role as far as maybe we need more monitoring or things like that. And so, yeah, and then just always, looking across the aisle and like be able to listen to other perspectives and trying to, find ways that you can find some common ground, I think would be really important.
And Mike, you've got the last word.
Wow. I'd say, it's an ecosystem and cultivate your champions, cultivate your processes, look at the elements and the infrastructure and see the big picture keep trying to educate and define where it is we're going. But cultivate those leaders. Stuck with Mike Lilligren, we worked together at Brunton in a natural ecosystem that developed a whole set of leaders that turned into businesses. And I would say the same is true in the outdoor recreational environment, as we've got to cultivate those pieces and support them and not get in their way. So that's it.
All right. Well, let's give a hearty thanks to our panelists for this afternoon.